Welcome to B'nai Abraham Chabad, and welcome to the bright side. Today's program is in memory of Dick Tucker, whose yahrzeit is today, and I'd like to start the prayer with the 88th Psalm, which talks about the suffering Israel endures in exile. And this is described in detail. A song by the sons of Korach for the conductor upon the machalat, which is a musical instrument to sing aloud. A maskil for Heman the Ezrachite. O Lord, God of my deliverance, by day I cried out to you. By night I offer my prayer before you. Let my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my supplication. For my soul is sated with affliction, and my life has reached the grave. I was reckoned with those who go down to the pit. I was like a man without strength. I'm regarded among the dead who are free, like corpses lying in the grave, of whom you are not yet mindful, who are yet cut off by your hand. You have put me into the lowest pit, into the darkest places, into the depths. Are your wondrous deeds known in the darkness of the grave, or your righteousness in the land of oblivion? But I, to you, O Lord, I cry. Each morning my prayer comes before you. Why, O Lord, do you forsake my soul? Why do you conceal your countenance from me? From my youth I have been afflicted and approaching death. Yet I have borne the fear of you, which is firmly established within me. Please join me in the mitzvah of tzedakah. Let's talk about the significance of a yahrzeit, the anniversary of a person's passing from this world. We're taught that all of the achievements of one's life, every word, every deed, even every thought, radiates and is revealed in the world and in the heavens on the anniversary of one's passing. The soul is expressed in its greatest glory on this day. And each year, the radiance again shines forth, both here on earth and in the heavens, as the soul is elevated to a higher spiritual realm and is drawn even closer to God with each passing year. The spiritual radiance can influence those below, but those of us who are here, loved ones, as well as acquaintances, friends, community members, can also benefit the soul above. And so every mitzvah that we do can actually elevate the soul and can improve, can bring great merit to the deceased in heaven. Dick's Hebrew name was Raphael Avraham ben Shimon. And it's interesting, the two names that he had, Raphael and Avraham, are both mentioned in a story in the Bible, in the beginning of Genesis. The story is recounted in the beginning of Genesis 18, where God appears to Abraham. Abraham, of course, as the founding father of Judaism, is given a test. At the age of 99 years old, he is commanded to circumcise himself. And as he's recovering from this painful circumcision, God makes it especially hot outside so that he does not have to entertain his guests in his open tent, which was his practice, to welcome guests, to feed them, to nourish their souls and bodies. And on this particular day, God himself comes to visit Abraham. And during their conversation, Abraham notices that there are 3 men passing by. And he notices that they hesitated to come. They were obviously in discomfort. And so he asks God to wait while he attends to his visitors. And he runs towards them and welcomes them. And of course, he thought that they were just 3 weary travelers and wanted the opportunity to extend hospitality to these people. But we know that these were 3 angels disguised as men. And one of these angels was in fact the angel, the archangel Raphael, whose mission it was to bring healing to Abraham. In Hebrew, the word for angel is a malach, which means a messenger. Each angel has a unique mission. They are a messenger, and God gives them the ability to fulfill that mission. And one of those angels was the angel of healing. So here in this story in Genesis, we have both names, Raphael, the angel, the agent of healing, coming to Avraham, coming to our forefather, our patriarch Abraham, to bring healing and to extend God's wishes of healing after he had passed this major test, the test of loyalty and faith, which was expressed through the mitzvah of the bris, through the circumcision. The sacred space in which we are presenting these programs is called the Dick Tucker Memorial Hall. And it serves as both the antechamber to our main sanctuary, as well as a beautiful space of learning for our young children in the preschool. 9 years ago, after Dick's passing, his wife, Diane, established the Dick Tucker Memorial Fund in everlasting memory of her husband. And the fund is earmarked for the historic preservation, the ongoing restoration needs of our historic building. Just last week, we needed to replace the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning of our main sanctuary, which was a large project and was made possible thanks to this fund. The Bright Side program is also dedicated in Dick's memory. And so it would be most appropriate for us to contribute to this fund, to give tzedakah in Dick's memory. Today, on the day of his yahrzeit, checks can be mailed into the shul, or you can go online to our website, phillyshul.com, and designate your gift to the Dick Tucker Memorial Fund in Dick's memory. I'd like to take a moment to extend our blessings to Diane on this day. We wish you long life, happy and healthy years, and may the soul of your beloved husband be elevated in the heavenly spheres. May his neshama have an aliyah. Those of us who were fortunate to know Dick remember him as a rational person, a person who was a builder, very much down to earth, but also a community leader, a lay leader in our community, a visionary. And he would often counsel people and advise them not to be fearful or anxious over things that they cannot control. He was very practical in that way. And so I'd like to invite to our program today a leading neuroscientist who will give us insight into the mind, into the brain, in honor of Dick's yahrzeit. Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Newberg, Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and Medical College. Dr. Newberg, welcome to the Bright Side program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the program.
So I'd like to start by asking you to help us understand what is this term called neurotheology?
So neurotheology, from my perspective, is an emerging field really in the last maybe 20 or 30 years that is trying to understand the relationship or the link between our religious and spiritual selves and our biological selves, in particular, the human brain. Now, that's sort of my simplistic definition of it, but I always like to expand a few important points about that. One is that that it is, I view it as a two-way street, meaning that it is not just science looking at religious and spiritual ideas. It is not religious or spiritual ideas and beliefs and theology looking at science, but it is the two of them looking at each other. You know, how can we understand who we are as human beings, utilizing what arguably are the two most powerful forces that have shaped human history, the religious and spiritual on one side, and the science and technological on the other side. And so for me to have it work as a term, it's really a very integrated, hybrid, multidisciplinary approach. And with that being said, that's the next piece of this, which is, you know, there are a lot of possible terms that perhaps we could have used, psychospirituality and biotheology and so forth, bioreligion. Neurotheology seems to be the one that has stuck, I think in part just because it kind of sounds the coolest, but ultimately, I think for it to work as a term though, the neuro side needs to be defined very broadly. So it's neuroscience, neuroimaging, which is a lot of the work that I have done. It also includes anthropology and psychology and medicine, you know, all the different ways which we kind of get at the biological part of who we are. And of course, theology is a very specific discipline that is looking at the foundational beliefs of a given tradition and how we can start to understand that in a lot of different complex ways. And we certainly can look at that, you know, how do we think about things theologically? But we also have to understand that we can look at many other aspects, all the other aspects of what it means to be religious or spiritual. So it includes beliefs and various ideas and moral beliefs and so forth that people have. It can include various practices like meditation or prayer or other types of practices that people do. And ultimately, it's about the experiences themselves. And that can be anywhere from a relatively basic experience of what it feels like to walk into a beautiful synagogue to a full-blown mystical experience that somebody might have, and all of the different, you know, the whole continuum in between. So I think if we kind of keep those different aspects, those different perspectives in mind about what neurotheology is, it works as a term. And I think it's a very exciting field that in some sense has its roots going back thousands of years. In the Torah, it talks a lot about, you know, it doesn't mention the frontal lobe, but it talks about, you know, how we are as human beings, how we act, how we behave, how we think, and what are the things that we need to be able to do in order to interact with God. Other traditions, Buddhism, Hinduism, you know, frequently talk about the mind and psychology and consciousness and so forth. So there, you know, many traditions have addressed these basic topics. We just, you know, didn't have the PET scans and the MRI scans to be able to do the research that we currently have the opportunity to do now.
Really fascinating stuff. So I understand that you are an author as well of a number of books, one of them being The Rabbi's Brain.
Right.
So have you developed the technology to be able to analyze my brain via Zoom?
Well, not by Zoom yet, but we're getting close. You know, it was a lot of fun to write that book, The Rabbi's Brain. It was with a student at the time and now colleague, David Halpern, who by training is also a rabbi. And you know, what we really wanted to do was try to understand, you know, the Jewish brain, the rabbi's brain. You know, what do people think about as they engage Judaism, and how do we, you know, start to look at that very specifically? And you know, there's a lot of very, you know, you say, can I do it by Zoom? Well, one of the ways I can do it is by asking questions. And one of the core pieces of the book is a survey that we did where we asked a bunch of questions to about 150 or so rabbis from all the different denominations, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, and Reconstructionist, at least is sort of the four major ones right now. And we asked them questions. We asked them questions about how they think, what they feel, their motivations for, you know, becoming religious or spiritual, or even for becoming a rabbi. And so, there are a lot of different ways in which we can actually think about understanding. If you say, I use my emotions a lot to be a rabbi, then part of what we are able to do is say, well, what are the emotional areas of the brain, and how are they activated, and how are they turned on or off? And of course, ultimately, we can do the brain scans where we can bring people in to be able to explore exactly what's going on in the brain when people are engaged in various prayer practices or meditation practices, and look at the kinds of experiences that they have. And that was also another fun part of the book that we did, was that we scanned David Halpern's brain and my brain while we were doing the Shema, and looking at the differences that were going on. Of course, that's just one possibility. There are so many different questions that we can ask about in terms of looking at what's going on in the brain.
Wow, so you're actually able to take like these neuro images of the brain during the spiritual practices of
Yes.
prayer, and then analyze what was going on. Really,
Exactly.
really interesting.
Yeah, and not to be the teaser, so to speak. I mean, what was fascinating, of course, while my background is Judaism, I was raised in more of a Reform Jewish household, and so David's beliefs and his engagement is certainly far greater than mine. And his brain scan showed a lot of different kinds of changes while doing the Shema, while mine unfortunately didn't show quite as many as I was hoping it would show. But also showed some very unique patterns that were different than what we've scanned maybe 400 or 500 people doing pretty much from almost every tradition, at least the major traditions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and so forth, and of course Judaism, and many other subdisciplines there within all of them. And there was definitely a very unique pattern that David's brain had, and we're hoping to be able to continue to explore and expand upon that to try to understand what are the unique aspects biologically of Judaism, in addition to what obviously people understand are the unique aspects of it, just in terms of what it is as a religion. But because of its uniqueness, it should arguably result in some unique changes in the brain itself. And that's part of what we saw.
Wow. So one of the themes that we've been discussing here on this program is the power of positive thinking, and how important it is to maintain an attitude, an approach of hope, of optimism, of positivity, especially when it comes to healing. When a person is seeking healing, and the importance of the patient's mindset in approaching that healing. I've asked quite a few medical professionals their opinions. Some have cited studies, others have given anecdotal data to illustrate that just how important it is to have that positive mindset as a patient, and how that can actually impact one's physical healing or the biological stuff that you're describing. So
Right.
I'm really interested to hear your perspective on that,
Sure.
and whether you've done any research in that area.
Well, one of the other books that I wrote was called "Words Can Change Your Brain," and a lot of that is talks very specifically about the positive versus the negative, the positive words, the positive language, the positive thoughts that we have, and contrast that with negative words, negative thoughts, and how they have an impact on our brain and our body. And as you mentioned, I mean, certainly we could go and cite that people who have higher levels of optimism tend to do better, tend to live longer, tend to have less disease, and so forth. And that's all great. And there's both anecdotal stories, as you said, as well as research that supports that. Part of what I always get into is the brain and the body and what's happening. And so, there's a couple of really important points about that. One is that when you have positive thoughts, when you have positive outlook on things, what this actually activates certain areas of your brain that are involved in those positive emotions. And the brain is connected to the body. So what it does is that it helps to reduce the stresses that are felt in the body. It helps to reduce your blood pressure and your heart rate. And one of the big stress hormones is cortisol. That gets released whenever we have a kind of, more negative thoughts or negative things happening to us. So being more positive, your cortisol levels go down. And that's actually very important for the healing of the body. A lot of times, people, most people at least know that they'll go and get a little cortisone cream to put on your, on a rash or something like that. Well, the reason that that works in that context is that cortisol actually suppresses your immune system. So when you're very distressed, your cortisol levels are up and your immune system goes down, and that makes you more prone to illness and other kinds of cancers and other kinds of problems. On the other hand, when you are thinking positive thoughts, well, your cortisol levels go down, and that means your immune system function can go up, and your inflammatory markers go down, and so forth. And so you actually wind up having a healthier body. In fact, there was a very interesting study that looked at just a very simple meditation practice, and they did it with people receiving the flu vaccine. And they found that the people's response in terms of the amount of antibodies that they made was much higher in those people who had less stress because they did this simple meditation practice. So, you kind of extrapolate that to being a deeply religious individual who's engaged in various practices like prayer and meditation and positive thought processes. It changes the way your brain works. It changes the way your body works. And I think perhaps in many ways, the most important piece of all of this is that there's a kind of a cute phrase that neurons that fire together wire together. And what that means is that the more you think anything, the more those neural connections become strengthened in your brain and the more you operate along those lines. So if you continue to bring yourself to more positive, more optimistic ideas about things, then you are going to, those are the neural connections that will form. You will become more positive, more optimistic. You will, continue to develop those ideas and those beliefs, and that will over time also help again to improve, that it sort of helps to explain these clinical findings that people who are more optimistic and less distressed because of that tend to do better. On the other hand, if you are more distressed, if you're more negative, more angry, more fearful, more depressed, then your cortisol levels go up, your heart rate and your blood pressure go up, and you wind up having a poorer immune system. You have high levels of inflammatory markers that are circulating, and that makes you more prone to heart disease and stroke and cancers and infections. And so, there's some very biological reasons why the more positive people are, the better they tend to do. And again, if you focus on the negative, then your brain becomes kind of wired for the negative. If you focus on the positive, your brain becomes wired for the positive, and it can kind of go in either direction. And what's also, I guess, one last piece of good news for people is that even if you have a lot of negativity and, the brain has what's called neuroplasticity, it can change and it can adapt. So there are ways of, whether one uses various spiritual practices or, other approaches that might augment the positive viewpoints that people can have, that literally can change the way your brain operates.
So you know the difference between a Jewish optimist and a Jewish pessimist?
What's that? I don't think I've heard this one.
The Jewish pessimist says it can't get any worse. The Jewish optimist says, yes, it can. So it sounds like you're talking about the possibility for even somebody who's not naturally inclined to positive thinking to be able to cultivate that that mindset with work, with effort. It doesn't, some people say, this is who I am, this is my nature.
Right.
And from what you're describing, it sounds like a person can really control that and make in a proactive way, decide, I want to become a more positive person. I want to look at the bright side.
Right.
And therefore, by working on that as a discipline, they can actually cultivate a sense of optimism.
Absolutely. And, it's as with everything, there's a lot of complexities to it and a lot of important complexities that we need to pay attention to. I mean, so certainly, as with every aspect of humanity, there are some people who are just naturally more optimistic than other people. And most likely, if you have somebody who's generally really pessimistic, they're probably never going to be as optimistic as the most optimistic person. It's just like saying, if we all practice tennis 6 hours a day, we'd all get to be really good tennis players, but there's still going to be, the Roger Federers of the world and so forth, who are just better than everyone else. But that being said, we can all get better at it. And so we can move that needle, down the path towards being more positive, even if you tend to be a more negative person to begin with. But also, I think an important point is, as some of the data has also suggested, that there is a value in finding the appropriate balance for each person. There are times when it's appropriate to be a bit pessimistic. Sometimes you have to recognize when you're in a job that isn't a good job for you, when you're in a relationship that isn't a good relationship for you. And so there's a practicality, a pragmatism that comes with being negative. People who are more pessimistic will look at the world, can look at the world a little bit more critically, and I mean that in a good way. But then when it becomes destructive and when it becomes stressful and causes other issues, that's where it becomes problematic. And so when you can find a way, as you were saying, everyone can find a way through practice, through purposeful approaches, to be more compassionate and be more compassionate and understanding, not only towards others, but to themselves as well. And that's part of what we talk about in Words Can Change Your Brain, that it's also the words you're saying, to yourself about who you are as a person and what you can accomplish and do. And so, I would wholeheartedly agree that, people can, find a way to become more positive and more, and do that kind of, through various practices and approaches that can help people become that way. And it's exciting to be able to see people who are able to do that.
So words of prayer, for example, if a person decides that they want to get into the routine of daily prayer and they make that a habit of expressing those words, they can actually impact the person's brain and in a positive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the we've done a couple of longitudinal studies where we've asked people to do certain practices and we followed them over time. And the analogy that I like to use is the muscle. I mean, if you go to lift weights, what happens? Your muscle becomes bigger and it becomes stronger. And so what we find when we look at the brain of people who are doing various meditation practices is that actually there's some data, not from us, but from other colleagues, who actually have found that their brain, particularly the areas that are involved in helping to concentrate and focus attention, literally becomes thicker and bigger, just like a muscle. And also, when we look at our functional studies with MRI and PET and so forth, that their brain actually becomes more functionally stronger. And so their ability to concentrate is improved, their memory is improved, they are less depressed, they are less anxious, and there are clearly changes that occur that are long-term changes, not just while you're doing the practice, but they sustain beyond the practice. In fact, we did one study that looked at changes in neurotransmitters, and we found that the brain was more receptive to the sort of feel-good neurotransmitters of dopamine and serotonin after going through like a very intensive prayer retreat program. And it wasn't in a Jewish context, but certainly, the more you do these practices and the more you can actively engage them, typically, the greater the impact can be. And that's an important point too. It's one thing to just sort of say a prayer, and it's another thing to really mean it when you're saying it. And that, as I'm sure most of the listeners will understand, it's not just about saying it, it's about really getting engaged and doing it. And again, the data support that. We've done some brain scan studies that show that if you just say a practice or do a prayer, you get a little bit of an effect. But if you really believe in it and it becomes a part of who you are, especially over time, then that really can have a very powerful impact on the brain.
In our synagogue, we always remind people that God understands all languages and that it's best to pray in a language that you understand so that you can relate to the words and actually start to feel what you're saying, not just, recite words of the liturgy.
Right.
So that's important.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit of...
That's another interesting neurotheological question, which is, is it better to do a prayer like the Shema in Hebrew if you don't understand it, or do it in English or whatever your native tongue is, so that you at least understand what it is. And there's been some interesting arguments about both, and ultimately the good thing is that we should be able to develop some science to be able to explore that.
Sure, sure. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic that's been impacting all of us. It sounds like you are primarily in the research field.
Right.
How has the coronavirus impacted your work?
Well, it's been interesting. In line with the theme of the interview, I tend to be a pretty optimistic person, so I try to take advantage of the time that I had. Our research, because it was more elective kind of research, was mostly shut down for at least 3 or 4 months, from March through about June, and that gave me an opportunity to analyze the data that we had collected and work on writing papers and some books and things like that. So I actually wound up getting a lot done for me, but it was challenging, and certainly we were eager to get back to getting the data back and start doing the study. We had a meditation study that we had started in the fall, and that kind of ground to a halt, but we were able to get people back. So I think we made the most of it, and for me, it was a time to be able to spend a little bit more time with my family and analyze some data and get to some things that had been on the back burner for me. So I personally kind of enjoyed it. And, I knew it was a terrible situation, but I was trying to make it as pleasant as possible.
Well, that's certainly our challenge. Our challenge is to deal with the reality, but also to use our minds and brains to focus on how we can make the best out of a difficult situation. It sounds like you found the bright side in your research work, utilizing the downtime to be able to focus deeper and concentrate on the data that you're collecting.
Right.
Which is
right. And also, to me, a lot of what I do and what gets me excited is the creative piece to all of this. And when you talk about sort of being optimistic and positive, when you can engage creativity, and we've just recently published some articles on the creative brain. Creativity is something which really can have a very positive impact on you, and you can be creative anywhere, so you can, whether it's doing art or music or thinking about new ideas or rereading a passage of the Torah that you always were interested in trying to understand more deeply. There's always an opportunity to do something if you can find a way to engage that.
Beautiful. I'd love to learn more. It's just that looks like we're running out of time here. But your work sounds really, really intriguing, and I look forward to learning more about it. Do you have a website?
Yeah, sure. So if anybody's interested, they can go to my website. It's just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com, and they can find some of the research articles that we've done on all of these topics. They can find information about some of the different books, including The Rabbi's Brain, and also some of the future books. We got a lot of new things that'll be coming down the pike pretty soon, and continuing to push this whole field of neurotheology to understand the nature of our religious and spiritual selves, our biological selves, and ultimately ourselves, who we are as human beings. And that to me is the fundamental question.
Well, thank you so much for sharing a little glimpse into your world with all of us. It's fascinating how to hear about the link between these religious and spiritual experiences and the brain. I wish you a lot of continued success with the important work that you're doing, and God willing, we'll be able to. We can already wish each other a happy and sweet New Year as the holidays come up very, very soon. And,
absolutely. Hopefully, it will be a good year and for everyone, and hopefully we'll be looking back on this whole situation and moving forward, and that's hopefully the most important thing for all of us, I'm sure.
A year of good health.
Let's hope so.
And everyone should be safe And everyone should continue finding the bright side and the silver lining in their own life experiences.
Absolutely.
Dr. Newberg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. All the best.
Thank you for joining us today on the Bright Side program. If you enjoyed this program, we ask that you consider even a small contribution to B'nai Abraham Chabad to help these programs continue. I want to thank our sponsors for making this possible and wish you a wonderful week.